The rifle shot tore through the evening air as Lillian Payton ducked behind the water trough, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird. The bullet splintered the wooden post just inches from where her head had been moments before, sending fragments flying into her honey-colored hair. Her uncle's drunken curses echoed across the yard, promising that this time she wouldn't escape his wrath. Colorado Territory, 1875. The small mining town of Silverstone, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, had been Lillian's prison for the past 3 years. Ever since her parents' deaths from typhoid had left her in the reluctant care of her father's only brother, Vernon Payton. "You ungrateful little snake!" Vernon bellowed from the porch of the weathered farmhouse. "After all I've done for you." Lillian glanced desperately toward the tree line 50 yards away. If she could make it to the woods, she might have a chance. At 21, she was strong and fast, despite her uncle's meager provisions and cruel treatment. She had been saving every penny she could hide from his greedy hands, planning her escape for months. "I know you've been stealing from me," Vernon slurred, stumbling down the porch steps with his rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Found your little stash under the floorboards." Lillian's stomach dropped. All her careful planning, the $93.12 she'd painstakingly accumulated from selling eggs and mending clothes in town when Vernon was deep in his cups at the saloon, all of it gone. "It was my money," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Earned from my own work." Vernon's laughter was cruel as he approached the water trough. "Nothing in my house belongs to you. Nothing. Your daddy should have left you at an orphanage instead of burdening me." Lillian saw her chance when Vernon paused to take another swig from the whiskey bottle tucked in his coat pocket. She bolted, her worn boots kicking up dust as she sprinted toward the tree line. Another shot cracked the air. Pain seared through her upper arm, hot and sharp. She stumbled but kept running, knowing that stopping meant far worse than a bullet graze. "You come back here, girl!" Vernon roared behind her. "Or I swear to God I'll hunt you down like a rabid dog." The trees offered momentary sanctuary, but Lillian knew better than to stop. Vernon was a skilled tracker despite his drinking, having spent years as a bounty hunter before settling on this hardscrabble farm. She pressed her hand against the wound on her arm, feeling warm blood seeping through her sleeve as she pushed deeper into the forest. Night fell quickly in the mountains, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that made Lillian's teeth chatter. She'd lost her shawl in her desperate flight, and her thin cotton dress offered little protection against the autumn air. The sliver of moon overhead provided just enough light to navigate between the pines, but she had no real destination just away, anywhere away from Vernon. Hours later, exhaustion and blood loss forced her to stop. She slumped against a massive pine, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed little clouds in the cold night air. The forest was eerily silent around her, as if the wildlife sensed the human drama unfolding in their midst and chose to keep their distance. "Think," Lillian whispered to herself. "Think." Silverstone lay to the east, but Vernon would expect her to head there. North led deeper into the mountains, where early snow had already dusted the higher peaks. South was ranch country, where she might find work, but would be easily spotted on the open range. West led to the Tanner property, the largest cattle operation in the county, run by the reclusive Zachariah Xavier. Lillian had seen Zachariah Xavier only twice in her 3 years in Silverstone. Once at her parents' funeral, where he'd stood apart from the other mourners, tall and solemn in his black coat. The second time had been at the general store 6 months ago, where she'd nearly collided with him while carrying a sack of flour for Mrs. Holloway. He'd steadied her with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size, tipped his hat without a word, and continued on his way. The townspeople spoke of him in hushed tones, the youngest son of a Texas cattle baron who'd struck out on his own after some unnamed tragedy. Some said he'd killed a man in a duel over a woman. Others claimed he was running from the law. All agreed that he kept to himself, managed his ranch with quiet efficiency, and paid fair wages to the men who worked for him. Lillian made her decision. The Xavier Ranch was her best option. Even if they turned her away, the property was vast enough that she might slip through unnoticed and continue westward toward the next town. Dawn was breaking by the time she stumbled onto Xavier land, marked by a fence line of sturdy posts and barbed wire. Her arm had stopped bleeding but throbbed relentlessly, and hunger gnawed at her belly. The pristine white ranch house stood in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney against the pink morning sky. The baying of hounds froze her in her tracks. 3 large dogs crested the nearest hill, followed by a rider on a chestnut horse. Lillian swayed on her feet, too exhausted to run further. The rider approached at a gallop, the dogs circling around her but not attacking. As he drew closer, Lillian recognized the broad shoulders and strong jawline of Zachariah Xavier. He reined his horse to a stop a few feet away, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "You're trespassing, Miss Payton," he said, his voice deep and even. "I'm sorry," Lillian managed, fighting to remain upright. "I didn't know where else to go." Zachariah's gaze moved from her face to her bloodied sleeve, then back again. Without another word, he swung down from his saddle and approached her slowly, as one might a wounded animal. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a startling shade of green, set in a face weathered by sun and wind. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. "My uncle," Lillian replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He found my savings. I was going to leave." Something flickered across Zachariah's face. Anger, perhaps, or recognition of a familiar pain. He nodded once, decisively, and removed his coat to drape it over her shoulders. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing toward his horse. Lillian nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain she could stay conscious, let alone mounted. Zachariah seemed to read her thoughts, because he shook his head slightly and guided her toward his horse. "I'll walk," he said, lifting her effortlessly into the saddle. "The ranch is just over that rise." As they made their way toward the Xavier homestead, Lillian fighting to stay upright in the saddle, neither could have guessed how their lives would intertwine in the coming months, nor the dangers that awaited them both when Vernon Payton awoke to discover his niece had truly escaped. At the ranch, Zachariah's housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, clucked and fussed over Lillian like a mother hen. The elderly woman cleaned and bandaged the bullet graze, helped her into a nightgown that had belonged to Zachariah's late mother, and tucked her into bed in one of the guest rooms with broth and biscuits on a tray. "Poor lamb," Mrs. Abernathy murmured, smoothing Lillian's hair back from her forehead. "You rest now. Nobody will harm you here." For the first time in years, Lillian believed she might be safe. She drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, untroubled by dreams. Downstairs, Zachariah paced the length of his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. He had recognized Vernon Payton's handiwork immediately. The man had a reputation throughout the county for his mean disposition, particularly when drinking, which was most of the time. But to shoot at his own niece? That was beyond the pale, even for Vernon. Zachariah had heard whispers about Lillian's situation, the orphaned niece kept like a servant, rarely seen in town except on errands, always in the same 2 faded dresses. He'd noticed the bruises on her wrist that day at the general store, partially hidden by her sleeve, but visible when she'd reached for the flour sack. He'd wanted to say something then, but had held his tongue. It wasn't his business. Now she was under his roof, wounded and exhausted, and very much his business. A knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. His foreman, Miguel Reyes, entered at his acknowledgement. "Riders approaching from the east," Miguel reported. "Vernon Payton and 2 others. They're armed." Zachariah's jaw tightened. "Get the men together. Nobody comes onto this property making threats." Within minutes, Zachariah stood on his front porch, flanked by 6 of his ranch hands, all armed. Vernon Payton reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, 2 rough-looking men beside him. Vernon's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he took in the reception committee. "Xavier," he called out, slurring slightly even though the sun had barely cleared the mountains. "I've come for my niece." "Don't know what you're talking about, Payton," Zachariah replied evenly, though his hand rested near the revolver on his hip. Vernon spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine yard. "Like hell you don't. Girl ran off last night. Tracks lead straight to your property." "My dogs picked up someone crossing the north pasture before dawn," Zachariah acknowledged. "Ran them off. Might have been your niece, might not. Either way, they're long gone now." Vernon's eyes, cunning despite his intoxication, studied Zachariah's face. "You're lying. Always were too soft-hearted for your own good. And you were always too fond of shooting at things that can't shoot back," Zachariah countered, his voice hardening. "Women, for instance." The 2 men with Vernon shifted uncomfortably, glancing at their employer. It seemed this particular detail of the previous night's events hadn't been shared with them. "She stole from me," Vernon growled. "She's my responsibility, and I'll deal with her as I see fit." Zachariah took a deliberate step forward. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Payton. If, and I stress if, Miss Payton crossed my land, she's now beyond your reach. I suggest you return to town, file a report with Sheriff Collins if you're so inclined, and let the law handle this matter." Vernon's face contorted with rage. "You think your money makes you untouchable, Xavier? There are ways to get to you. Ways you won't see coming." "Is that a threat?" Zachariah asked quietly, his hand now resting openly on his revolver. A tense silence stretched between them. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Finally, Vernon broke the standoff with a harsh laugh. "Just stating facts," he said, turning his horse. "Come on, boys. We've wasted enough time here." As the 3 riders disappeared down the long drive, Miguel stepped closer to Zachariah. "He will be back, Patron." "I'm counting on it," Zachariah replied grimly. "Double the watch tonight. No one approaches the house without my knowledge." Upstairs, pressed against the window of her room, Lillian watched her uncle's retreat with a mixture of relief and dread. Vernon never forgot a slight, and he never forgave. By helping her, Zachariah Xavier had made himself a target of her uncle's vengeance, and for that, she could never forgive herself. Lillian recovered her strength over the next few days. Though the wound on her arm would leave a scar, Mrs. Abernathy provided her with simple but well-made dresses that had belonged to Zachariah's mother, altered to fit Lillian's more slender frame. The housekeeper also became a source of information about the mysterious rancher who had taken her in. Lost his parents and younger sister to cholera back in '68, Mrs. Abernathy confided as they shelled peas on the back porch. His older brother Henry took over the family ranch in Texas, but Mr. Zachariah couldn't bear to stay where the memories were so fresh. "Bought this land and built this house with his share of the inheritance. He's been kind to me," Lillian said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay him." Mrs. Abernathy's weathered face creased in a smile. "That man has more money than he knows what to do with, and not a soul to spend it on except himself. What he lacks is companionship. Been alone too long with his ghosts." Zachariah himself remained somewhat distant, joining Lillian for meals but speaking little. He spent his days working alongside his men, returning to the house dusty and tired in the evenings. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an unreadable expression, but he would quickly look away when their eyes met. A week after her arrival, Lillian found him in the study after dinner, examining a map spread across his desk. "Mr. Xavier," she said from the doorway, "may I speak with you?" He looked up, surprise flickering across his features before he schooled them back to neutrality. "Of course, Miss Payton. Please, come in." Lillian entered the warmly lit room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather chairs before the fireplace. I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness, and to discuss my future plans. Zachariah gestured toward one of the chairs, taking the other when she was seated. You're welcome to stay as long as necessary, Miss Payton. There's no rush to decide anything. That's very generous, Lillian replied, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. But I can't impose on you indefinitely. My uncle may have taken my savings, but I'm not afraid of hard work. I thought perhaps I could find employment in the next town over, where he wouldn't think to look for me. Zachariah studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. What skills do you have, Miss Payton? Lillian straightened her shoulders. I can cook, clean, and sew. I kept my uncle's accounts and managed the household budget. I've done some nursing. I cared for my parents during their illness, and I can read and write better than most, thanks to my mother's insistence on daily lessons. A ghost of a smile touched Zachariah's lips. Impressive. As it happens, I find myself in need of assistance with the ranch accounts. Mrs. Abernathy has been handling them, but her eyesight isn't what it used to be. Would you consider taking on that responsibility while you're here? I would pay you, of course. Lillian blinked in surprise. You would trust me with your accounts? You hardly know me. I'm a good judge of character, Miss Payton, Zachariah said simply. And it would give you time to recover fully and plan your next steps without financial worry. The offer was unexpected but welcome. Lillian found herself nodding before she had fully considered all the implications. Thank you. I accept. Something like satisfaction crossed Zachariah's face. Good. We'll start tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock in this room. As Lillian rose to leave, another question pressed on her mind. Mr. Xavier, has there been any word from town? About my uncle? Zachariah's expression darkened slightly. Sheriff Collins rode out yesterday while you were resting. Vernon filed a complaint accusing you of theft, but the sheriff didn't seem inclined to pursue it vigorously. Collins and your uncle have a history. Seems Vernon once courted the sheriff's sister and treated her poorly. The sheriff knows I'm here? Lillian asked, alarm rising in her voice. He suspects, Zachariah corrected. I neither confirmed nor denied it. But he did mention that as you're of legal age, you're free to live where you choose. Vernon has no legal claim on you or your whereabouts. Relief washed over Lillian, tempered by the knowledge that legal barriers rarely stopped Vernon Payton when he set his mind to something. Still, it was comforting to know that the law, at least, was not actively pursuing her. Thank you for telling me, she said. Good night, Mr. Xavier. Zachariah, he said suddenly as she reached the door. When she turned back in surprise, he added, If we're to work together, you might as well use my given name. Lillian smiled, a genuine expression that lightened her entire face. Then you must call me Lillian. Good night, Zachariah. Good night, Lillian, he replied softly. As autumn deepened toward winter, Lillian and Zachariah fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings were devoted to ranch accounts, with Lillian quickly proving her aptitude with numbers. Afternoons, she helped Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks or worked in the kitchen garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before frost claimed them. Zachariah continued his daily routine of riding out with his men, but he began returning to the house for lunch more frequently than he had before. Their conversations gradually extended beyond ranch business to books they had read, places they had visited, and careful exchanges about their lives before meeting. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father, Lillian shared one evening as they sat before the fire, snow falling gently outside the windows. She taught me to love learning for its own sake. My father wanted his sons to be educated as well as practical, Zachariah replied, swirling the brandy in his glass. He sent us both to university back east, though I think he always expected we'd return to ranching in the end. Do you miss your family? Lillian asked softly. A shadow passed over Zachariah's face. Every day. My brother writes regularly. He has a wife and 2 sons now. They've invited me to visit, but it hurts too much to go back, Lillian finished when he trailed off. Zachariah looked at her with surprise, as if she had read his thoughts. Yes, exactly that. As their friendship deepened, Lillian became increasingly aware of Zachariah as more than her benefactor. She noticed the way the firelight caught the angles of his face, the strength in his hands as he poured her tea, the rare but transformative nature of his smile. She caught herself watching for his return each day, listening for his footsteps in the hallway. For his part, Zachariah found himself seeking Lillian's company with greater frequency. He brought her wildflowers he found on his rides, ordered books he thought she might enjoy from the catalog, and listened with genuine interest to her opinions on everything from politics to poetry. The house, silent for so long, began to feel like a home again. But Vernon Payton's shadow still loomed over them. Reports from town spoke of his increased drinking, his threats against both Lillian and Zachariah, and his recruitment of questionable companions from among the miners and drifters who frequented the lowest saloons. Sheriff Collins rode out to warn them one crisp November afternoon. "He's making no secret of his intentions," the sheriff said grimly, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Abernathy. "Says he'll have his revenge on both of you before Christmas." "Let him try," Zachariah replied, his voice hard. "My men are alert, and the house is secure." Sheriff Collins shook his head. "Vernon's not stupid, despite his drinking. He won't come at you directly. Not with your men and your reputation with a gun. He'll find another way." Lillian, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. "What can we do, Sheriff?" Collins stood and tipped his hat to her. "Miss Payton, you're looking well." "Thank you," she replied. "But please answer my question." The sheriff sighed. "I've tried to run him out of town, but without concrete evidence of a crime, my hands are tied. Best advice I can give is to stay vigilant and avoid traveling alone, either of you. Vernon's not above ambush." After the sheriff departed, Zachariah insisted on increasing security measures around the ranch. The hands took turns patrolling the property boundaries, and no one rode out alone, not even Zachariah himself. The carefree days of autumn gave way to a winter of watchfulness. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, Lillian and Zachariah grew closer. The threat hanging over them created a strange intimacy, a shared secret that bound them together against a common enemy. Their evening conversations by the fire became the bright center of days otherwise darkened by vigilance and worry. "Tell me about your dreams," Zachariah asked her one snowy evening in early December. "Before all this, what did you want for your life?" Lillian considered the question, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "I wanted freedom, I suppose. The chance to make my own choices. My mother always said a woman should have her own means of support, her own place in the world." "And now?" Zachariah prompted when she fell silent. Lillian met his gaze, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how the firelight softened his features and warmed his green eyes. "Now I want something I never thought to want before." "What's that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A home," Lillian replied simply. "Not just a place to live, but somewhere I belong. People who—" She hesitated, then finished softly. "People who care whether I come or go." Zachariah reached across the space between their chairs, his hand covering hers. "I care, Lillian, very much." The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Then Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with a tray of hot chocolate, and the spell was broken. Zachariah withdrew his hand, and Lillian busied herself with smoothing her skirts. both a little flustered by what had almost transpired. Later that night, Lillian stood at her bedroom window, watching the snow fall in the moonlight. Her feelings for Zachariah had grown from gratitude to friendship to something deeper, something that made her heart race when he entered a room and ache when he was absent. But she was still the penniless niece of the town drunk, a woman with nothing to her name but the clothes she wore, clothes that Zachariah himself had provided. What could she possibly offer a man like him? In his own room, Zachariah faced similar doubts. Lillian had come to him in desperate circumstances, dependent on his protection and generosity. To declare his growing feelings now would be to take advantage of her vulnerability, to potentially pressure her into reciprocating out of gratitude or fear of rejection. He had to be certain of her heart, and of her freedom to choose without obligation. The opportunity to clarify their feelings came unexpectedly and in the worst possible way. 3 days before Christmas, a package arrived for Lillian, delivered by a nervous-looking boy from town. Mrs. Abernathy accepted it in Lillian's absence. She was in the kitchen, preparing dough for Christmas cookies, and brought it to Zachariah first, her instincts warning her that something was amiss. "No card with it," she said, placing the small box on his desk. "Just Miss Payton's name." Zachariah frowned, examining the box without touching it. "Who delivered it?" "Tommy Jenkins. From the general store. Said a man paid him to bring it out. Didn't give a name." Zachariah's frown deepened. "Fetch Miguel, please, and keep Lillian in the kitchen for now." When Miguel arrived, Zachariah explained his concerns. Together, they carefully opened the package to reveal a small silver locket nestled in cotton batting. Miguel reached for it, but Zachariah stopped him. "Wait," he said, peering more closely at the locket. A fine dusting of white powder was visible in the etched designs of the silver. "Don't touch it. I think it's poisoned." Miguel crossed himself. "Madre de Dios. Vernon." "Without a doubt," Zachariah replied grimly. "He knows she would wear it, maybe even kiss it if there was a note saying it had been her mother's." The two men carefully resealed the package and secured it in a locked cabinet. Then Zachariah sent for Sheriff Collins, who arrived the following morning to collect the evidence. "This is attempted murder," Collins said, his weathered face grave as he examined the locket through the glass jar where they had sealed it. "I'll have Vernon arrested by nightfall." But Vernon Payton had vanished from town, his shabby house abandoned, his few possessions gone. The sheriff organized a search, but a blizzard swept in that afternoon, obliterating any tracks and forcing the posse to return empty-handed. Lillian took the news of her uncle's murderous attempt with remarkable calm, though Zachariah noticed her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea that evening. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly when Mrs. Abernathy had left them alone in the parlor. Lillian set the teapot down carefully. "I always knew he hated me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "from the moment my parents died and he was forced to take me in, but to try to kill me." She shook her head. "I never thought he would go that far." "He won't get near you," Zachariah promised, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "I won't let him." Lillian looked up at him, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's not just me I'm worried about. He hates you now too, for helping me. If anything happened to you because of me—" "Nothing is going to happen to either of us," Zachariah interrupted, taking her hands in his. "Vernon is a coward at heart. Now that his plan has failed and the sheriff is looking for him, he'll likely flee the territory altogether." Lillian wasn't convinced, but she nodded, drawing comfort from Zachariah's nearness and the warm strength of his hands around hers. For a long moment they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire and the howl of the blizzard outside the only sounds. "Lillian," Zachariah began hesitantly, "there's something I've been wanting to tell you." She looked up at him expectantly, her heart suddenly racing. "These past months, having you here?" He paused, searching for the right words. I've never been good at expressing myself, but you've brought something to this house, to my life, that I didn't know was missing. Lillian held her breath, afraid to hope for what his words might mean. Zachariah continued, his voice growing more confident. I know our beginning was unconventional, and there are still dangers to face, but I find myself thinking of the future in a way I haven't since I lost my family. A future that includes you, if you would consider. A tremendous crash from the kitchen interrupted his words, followed by Mrs. Abernathy's scream. Zachariah was on his feet instantly, pulling Lillian up with him. Stay here, he ordered, reaching for the revolver he had taken to keeping on the mantelpiece. No, Lillian replied firmly, grabbing a poker from the fireplace. I'm coming with you. Together they moved cautiously toward the kitchen, Zachariah leading with his revolver raised. The scene that greeted them was one of destruction. The back door had been smashed open, snow swirling in through the broken panels. Mrs. Abernathy stood pressed against the far wall, a carving knife clutched in her shaking hands. 3 men, she gasped, broke in and headed for the cellar door. I tried to stop them, but they threatened to shoot me. Zachariah turned to Lillian. The cellar has an outside entrance. They must have... Another crash, this time from the front of the house, interrupted him. Miguel's voice called out a warning, followed by the sound of gunfire. It's a diversion, Zachariah realized, his face hardening. They're drawing our attention to the cellar while they come in another way. As if to confirm his words, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. Zachariah pushed Lillian behind him just as Vernon Payton appeared in the kitchen doorway, a shotgun in his hands and 2 rough-looking men flanking him. Well, Vernon drawled, his bloodshot eyes gleaming with malice. Isn't this cozy? You're making a mistake, Payton, Zachariah said evenly, his revolver trained on Vernon's chest. My men will be here any second. Vernon laughed, an ugly sound. Your men are busy with my diversion on the other side of the house. By the time they realize the real threat, we'll be long gone with my thieving niece. Lillian's hand tightened on Zachariah's arm. I'm not going anywhere with you, Uncle Vernon. Didn't ask what you wanted, girl, Vernon snarled. You're coming with me, one way or another. Got some interested parties over in Durango willing to pay good money for a pretty young thing like you. Zachariah's expression turned murderous. Over my dead body. That can be arranged, Vernon replied, raising his shotgun. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion and sound. Zachariah fired first, his bullet catching one of Vernon's men in the shoulder and spinning him into the wall. The second man lunged forward, knife drawn, only to be met by Mrs. Abernathy's carving knife, thrown with surprising accuracy for a woman of her years. Vernon, momentarily distracted by his fallen companions, redirected his shotgun toward Lillian. Zachariah threw himself in front of her just as Vernon fired, the blast deafening in the confined space. Zachariah staggered but remained standing, returning fire with a shot that struck Vernon in the chest. Vernon's expression changed from rage to disbelief as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt. He took one stumbling step backward, then another, before collapsing heavily to the floor. The sudden silence was broken by shouts from the front of the house as Miguel and the other ranch hands, having dealt with the diversion, rushed to the kitchen. They quickly secured Vernon's wounded companions while Mrs. Abernathy, shaken but unhurt, went for bandages. Lillian, emerging from behind Zachariah, gasped when she saw blood soaking through the sleeve of his shirt. You're hurt! Zachariah glanced down at his arm as if noticing the wound for the first time. Just a graze. Buckshot scattered. His attention was fixed on Vernon, who lay motionless on the kitchen floor, eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Miguel checked for a pulse, then shook his head. He is gone, Patron. Lillian moved slowly to stand over her uncle's body, her expression a complex mixture of relief and regret. So much hatred in one man, she murmured. What a waste of a life. Zachariah came to stand beside her, wincing slightly as the adrenaline ebbed and the pain of his wound made itself known. I'm sorry it ended this way. Lillian turned to him, her eyes clear and direct. I'm not. He would never have stopped coming after us. At least now it's over. The days following Vernon's death were busy with official statements to Sheriff Collins, arrangements for Vernon's burial in the town cemetery, and recovery from the attack. Vernon's accomplices, once treated for their wounds, were taken to the county jail to await trial for attempted kidnapping and murder. The Christmas they had planned was subdued but not canceled. Mrs. Abernathy insisted that after such darkness, they needed the light and hope that the holiday represented. The house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and a small tree stood in the corner of the parlor, adorned with candles and ornaments brought carefully from Zachariah's family home in Texas. On Christmas Eve, with the ranch hands gathered in the bunkhouse for their own celebration, and Mrs. Abernathy retired early with a cup of her special Christmas punch, Lillian and Zachariah found themselves alone in the parlor. The interrupted conversation from the night of the attack had not been resumed, both of them perhaps uncertain where to begin after all that had happened. Zachariah broke the silence first, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small box. I had planned to give you this before everything happened. Lillian accepted the box tentatively, remembering the last package that had been meant for her. It's safe, Zachariah assured her with a small smile. I promise. Lillian opened the box to reveal a delicate gold locket, heart-shaped and engraved with intertwining vines. It's beautiful, she breathed, lifting it from its velvet nest. Open it, Zachariah encouraged. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents, painted in miniature. Lillian gasped, her eyes filling with tears. How did you? I wrote to the family that bought your parents' house, Zachariah explained. Asked if they had found any photographs during the renovation. They sent me a daguerreotype they discovered behind a loose baseboard. I had a miniaturist in Denver create the portrait from it. Lillian clutched the locket to her heart, too moved for words. Finally, she managed to whisper, Thank you. This means more to me than I can say. Zachariah took her free hand in his. Lillian, that night when we were interrupted, I was trying to tell you something important. Something I've felt for some time but wasn't sure how to express. Lillian's heart began to race again as she looked into his earnest green eyes. I love you, Zachariah said simply. Not out of pity or obligation, but because you are the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. These past months with you have shown me that life can be full and bright again, even after loss. Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. I love you too, she whispered. I've tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, that I couldn't possibly deserve someone like you, but... Don't, Zachariah interrupted gently. Don't diminish what you are or what you deserve. You are everything I never knew I was searching for. He reached into his pocket again and withdrew another, smaller box. Kneeling before her, he opened it to reveal a ring of gold set with a single perfect diamond. Lillian Payton, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Lillian looked from the ring to Zachariah's face, alight with love and hope. In that moment, all the fear and uncertainty of the past years fell away, leaving only the certainty that this was where she belonged, with this man who had saved her in more ways than one. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear. Yes, I will marry you, Zachariah Xavier. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to take her in his arms, Lillian knew that the cellar door her uncle had tried to lock her behind, both literally in his home and figuratively in her life, had been broken forever. In its place stood an open doorway to a future filled with love, security, and the freedom she had always sought. Their wedding took place in the spring, when the mountain meadows were carpeted with wildflowers and the air was sweet with promise. Sheriff Collins gave the bride away, Mrs. Abernathy cried happy tears throughout the ceremony, and Miguel surprised everyone with his fine tenor voice, singing a traditional Spanish love song during the reception. News of Vernon's death, and the circumstances surrounding it, had traveled quickly through the territory. Rather than facing judgment for seeking sanctuary from abuse, Lillian found herself met with sympathy and support from the townspeople, many of whom had suffered Vernon's mean-spiritedness over the years. Zachariah's brother Henry traveled from Texas with his family for the wedding, bringing with him their mother's veil for Lillian to wear. The reunion of the brothers, too long separated by grief, was a healing moment for both. Henry's two young sons immediately adopted Lillian as their aunt, following her everywhere during their visit and begging for stories. As spring turned to summer, Lillian and Zachariah settled into married life with a joy that touched everyone around them. The ranch thrived under their combined management, Lillian's head for numbers, and Zachariah's knowledge of cattle proving to be a formidable partnership. In July, Lillian shared the news that their family would be growing by winter. Zachariah's response was to lift her off her feet and spin her around the parlor, his laughter echoing through the house that had once been so silent. Their daughter, Emma Rose Xavier, was born on a snowy night in December, exactly 1 year after Zachariah had proposed. She had her mother's blue eyes and her father's determined chin, and from her very first cry, she was surrounded by love. As Lillian watched Zachariah cradle their newborn daughter by the fireplace, tears of joy glistening in his green eyes, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From terror and desperation in the shadow of her uncle's rage, to the warmth and security of a love she had never dared to imagine, it seemed almost impossible that one life could contain such extremes. "What are you thinking?" Zachariah asked softly, looking up to find her watching them. "I'm thinking that some doors need to be broken," Lillian replied, crossing the room to join her family by the fire, "so that something beautiful can enter." Zachariah shifted Emma to one arm so he could draw Lillian close with the other. "I'll break down any door for you," he murmured against her hair. "Always." As snow fell gently outside and their daughter slept peacefully between them, Lillian and Zachariah held each other close in the home they had created together, a sanctuary of love built from the ruins of fear, a fortress of happiness stronger than any cellar door. In the years that followed, the Xavier Ranch became known throughout the territory, not only for its fine cattle and fair business practices, but for the warmth and welcome that awaited anyone who crossed its threshold. Lillian and Zachariah opened their home to others in need of sanctuary, battered wives, orphaned children, veterans struggling to find their place after the horrors of war. The cellar where Vernon had once tried to imprison Lillian was transformed into a root cellar and wine storage, its door always propped open during the day, a symbol of the freedom that defined their home. The story of how Zachariah had broken down Vernon's door to rescue Lillian became part of local lore, embellished with each telling until it took on the quality of legend, the brave cowboy who saved the maiden from her wicked uncle. Lillian would laugh at these exaggerated versions, but privately she cherished the truth that sometimes salvation comes not in grand gestures, but in simple moments of courage, in a hand extended when needed most, in the decision to stand firm against cruelty. Their family grew as the years passed. Emma was joined by twin brothers, Henry and James, and later by a second daughter, Clara. The house, once so silent and haunted by Zachariah's ghosts, rang with children's laughter and the bustle of a happy household. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachariah surprised Lillian with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had always dreamed of visiting. As they stood on the deck of a ferry crossing the bay, watching the sun set over the water, Lillian leaned back against her husband's chest and sighed contentedly. Happy? He asked, his arms encircling her waist. Beyond words, she replied, turning to look up at him. The years had added silver to his temples and laugh lines around his eyes, but he was still as handsome to her as the day he had lifted her onto his horse and brought her to safety. Do you ever think about that first day? Zachariah asked. When I found you at the fence line? Lillian nodded. Often. I was so afraid. So certain that I had nowhere to turn. And I was so alone without knowing it, Zachariah mused, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. We saved each other, Lillian said simply. Zachariah tightened his arms around her. We did. And we continue to. Every day. As they returned to their hotel, hand in hand under the stars of a city far from the mountain ranch they called home, both knew that the greatest adventure of their lives had begun that day at the fence line, an adventure of love that would carry them through all the seasons of their lives together. Back at the ranch, their children thrived under the guidance of both parents and the extended family of ranch hands, particularly Miguel and Mrs. Abernathy, who considered the Xavier children as much their own as if they shared blood. Emma, the eldest, inherited her mother's quick mind and her father's quiet strength. By 15, she was already expressing interest in attending university, perhaps to study medicine, a path her parents encouraged, despite the raised eyebrows of more traditional neighbors. The twins, Henry and James, were as different as two brothers could be while still being inseparable. Henry had a gift with horses that bordered on supernatural, while James preferred books and numbers, often helping Lillian with the ranch accounts. Clara, the youngest, was a free spirit who could usually be found with dirt under her fingernails and leaves in her hair, exploring every corner of the ranch with unbounded curiosity. Together, they formed a family bound not just by blood, but by the shared understanding that safety and love were birthrights, not privileges to be earned or withheld, a lesson Lillian and Zachariah had learned through hardship and were determined their children would never have to doubt. On a clear autumn day, much like the one when Lillian had fled her uncle's farm, the family gathered on the front porch to watch a rider approaching up the long drive. Emma, now 18 and preparing to leave for university in Denver, was the first to recognize the visitor. "It's Sheriff Collins," she called, waving enthusiastically. The aging lawman, now more gray than not but still straight-backed in the saddle, returned her wave as he approached. "To what do we owe the pleasure, Sheriff?" Zachariah asked as Collins dismounted, accepting the man's firm handshake. "Bringing news and a request," Collins replied, nodding respectfully to Lillian. "Madam, you're looking well." "As are you, Sheriff," Lillian replied warmly. "Come in for coffee and tell us your news." Inside, with the children sent to complete their chores despite their protests at being excluded from adult conversation, Collins explained his visit. "I'm retiring come spring," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Abernathy. 25 years is enough for any man, and my joints aren't what they used to be." "You've served the county well," Zachariah commented. "You'll be missed." Collins nodded his thanks. "That brings me to my request. The town council is looking for nominations for my replacement. Your name has come up, Zachariah." Surprise registered on Zachariah's face. "Mine? I have no experience as a lawman." "You have experience with justice, though," Collins replied, "and that's what folks remember. How you stood up for Lillian against Vernon when no one else would. How you've helped others since. The county needs someone with a strong moral compass, someone people respect." Zachariah glanced at Lillian, seeking her reaction. "It's something to consider," she said thoughtfully. "The twins are old enough now to take on more responsibility with the ranch, and Miguel could handle the day-to-day operations." "Would you be happy in town?" Zachariah asked her. "This has been our home for so long." Lillian smiled, reaching for his hand across the table. Home is where you are, Zachariah. Besides, we'd only be a short ride away, and the change might be good for Clara, more children her age to play with. Collins watched their exchange with satisfaction. No need to decide today. Think it over. Discuss it with your family. But know that you'd have the support of many if you chose to accept. After Collins departed, Zachariah and Lillian walked to the ridge overlooking their ranch, a favorite spot for private conversations throughout their marriage. Sheriff Xavier, Lillian mused, a smile playing at her lips. It has a certain ring to it. Zachariah chuckled, but his expression was thoughtful. Would I be good at it, do you think? Enforcing the law? You already live by a code stricter than most laws, Lillian replied. And you've always had a sense for justice over mere rules. I think you'd be excellent. And you? Zachariah asked, turning to face her fully. Would you be happy with the change? Being the sheriff's wife would be different from being a rancher's wife. Lillian's laugh was light and genuine. I've been many things in my life, Zachariah. A daughter, an orphan, a prisoner in my uncle's home, a fugitive, your wife, a mother. Each change has brought its challenges, but the last 15 years have taught me that with you beside me, I can face anything. Zachariah drew her into his arms, his expression tender. When did you become so wise? Around the time a tall, green-eyed rancher lifted me onto his horse and carried me to safety, Lillian replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. The decision wasn't made that day, but as autumn turned to winter and then to spring, the idea took root and grew. By the time Sheriff Collins officially retired, Zachariah had accepted the nomination and been elected by a comfortable margin. The family moved into a spacious house near the center of town, though they kept the ranch, with Miguel promoted to foreman and given a share in the profits. Emma left for university that same spring, her letters home full of excitement about her studies and the wider world she was discovering. Lillian found her own role in town, establishing a small school for children whose families couldn't afford the formal academy. She taught reading, writing, mathematics, and history, but most importantly, she taught her pupils that knowledge was power and that no door, literal or figurative, should ever keep them from pursuing their dreams. Sheriff Zachariah Xavier quickly established himself as fair but firm, dealing even-handedly with disputes and maintaining order without heavy-handed tactics. His reputation spread throughout the county and beyond, bringing a period of stability to a region that had known its share of lawlessness. As for the cellar where Vernon had once tried to imprison his niece, it became part of a story told to remind people that sometimes the most important act of courage is reaching out a hand to someone in need, just as Zachariah had done for Lillian all those years ago when he broke down a door and held her close, beginning a journey that would transform not only their lives, but the lives of all who knew them. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the town settled for the night, Lillian and Zachariah would sit together on their porch, watching the stars appear over the mountains, their hands intertwined as they had been since that first night by the fire, a connection forged in desperate circumstances and tempered by years of joy, sorrow, challenge, and unwavering love. No regrets? Zachariah would sometimes ask, a ritual question from their earliest days together. And Lillian would always answer the same way, with a smile that held all the certainty in the world. Not a single one. Every step led me to you. In this way, they built their life together, door by door, room by room, year by year, a sanctuary where love reigned and freedom was the foundation of every happiness they shared.